Friends, in today's video, you'll witness one of the most powerful stories of our time, a story that begins in a mansion of wealth and ends in a garden of truth. When a billionaire stepped outside his luxurious home one morning, he expected to see perfection, trimmed hedges, shining fountains, and beauty everywhere. But what he saw instead stopped his heart. His maid, a quiet, hard-working woman, was on her knees eating grass. Not because she was insane, not because she was strange, but because she was hungry. That single moment shattered everything he thought he knew about kindness, privilege, and power. And what happened next changed not just his home, but his entire life. Stay till the end. This story will break your heart and heal it at the same time. If you believe compassion can change the world, hit the like button, share this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because this is not just a story about a maid, it's about humanity, and the day a billionaire finally learned to kneel. The morning light spilled across the Fairview estate like liquid gold, cutting through the mist that still clung to the hedges and fountains. Inside the mansion, everything was quiet, the kind of quiet that belonged to people who never had to rush. The marble floor gleamed, the chandeliers shimmered faintly, and the air smelled faintly of money, of old order, of comfort earned long ago by someone else's labor. Charles Fairview stood in the center of that silence, adjusting the cuff of his tailored suit. He was a man who looked born for control, precise, polished, the kind of man who didn't raise his voice because the world always listened anyway. Yet this morning, something tugged at his attention. Through the tall French doors, a flicker of movement drew his eye. Beyond the manicured gardens, past the stone fountain shaped like an angel pouring water from a jar, he saw a figure kneeling on the grass. The sun hit her shoulders, catching the faint sheen of sweat on her neck. At first glance, he thought she was tending the flower beds, maybe pulling weeds or trimming the edges. But the longer he looked, the stranger it became. Her hands were trembling. He set his briefcase down. No gardener worked like that. No one knelt with such desperation. Charles leaned closer to the glass, squinting through the glare. Then his stomach went cold. The woman, Maya Williams, one of the housemaids, was plucking handfuls of grass and pushing them into her mouth. For a moment, his mind refused to understand what he was seeing. His brain, so used to spreadsheets and meetings, tried to turn it into something rational. Maybe she dropped something. Maybe she was cleaning. But then he saw the way her shoulders shook as she chewed, the way her jaw trembled, as if she were swallowing shame instead of food. Something ancient and unfamiliar stirred inside him. Horror. The world around him stopped moving. The hum of the air conditioner, the ticking of the clock, even the soft chatter of the cleaning crew down the hall, all of it vanished. He pushed open the French doors. The air outside was bright and cold, filled with the smell of cut grass and distant lavender. "Maya," he said softly. She startled like a hunted animal, twisting toward him, her eyes wide, her lips green-stained. A blade of grass clung to her mouth. She brushed it away, trembling. "Mr. Fairview, Her voice broke. Please don't say anything." He stepped closer, his shoes crunching over the gravel. "Maya, what are you doing?" Her body stiffened, as if the question itself was a weapon. She looked around, toward the side of the house, toward the kitchen windows, and shook her head. "Please, sir, I'm fine. I haven't eaten since yesterday," he froze. "Since yesterday?" But before she could reply, the sound of the sliding door came again. Elaine Fairview appeared in the sunlight, like something carved from marble. Her silk robe shimmered, her hair smooth and perfect, her lips a deep, deliberate red. She held a porcelain cup of coffee as if it were a trophy. "What on earth is going on?" she demanded, her tone already dripping with suspicion. "Charles, why are you outside with her?" He didn't look at his wife. "Elaine," he said quietly, "Maya hasn't eaten. She was out here eating grass." Elaine blinked, and then, to his disgust, actually sneered. "I told her," she said coolly. "The kitchen is for family, not for help." Something in his chest went tight. She's starving, Elaine. You banned her from the kitchen? I banned her because I have standards, she said, taking a calm sip of her coffee. I will not have dirty hands touching our food. If she wants to eat, she can bring her own bread. We pay her enough. Charles turned slowly toward her.
Standards?
His voice was quiet but shaking. You call starving a woman standards? Elaine's gaze hardened. Don't get emotional, Charles. She knows her place. That's why this house runs the way it does. But Maya's soft voice broke through. Please, sir, she whispered. It's all right. I send my money home. My son's sick in Atlanta. If I lose this job, she swallowed hard, he won't survive. The air shifted. Charles felt as if the ground beneath him had split open. The sight of her, shaking, humiliated, still trying to protect the people who hurt her, hit him harder than any courtroom loss, any business betrayal. He took one slow step forward, then another, and before Elaine could react, he dropped to one knee in the wet grass. Elaine gasped. Charles! But he didn't hear her. He looked up at Maya, his voice breaking. Forgive me, he said. Not just for today. For all the days I let this happen under my roof. Maya stared at him, her lips parted, too stunned to answer. It ends now, he whispered. No one in my house eats grass to stay alive. For a long moment no one moved. The breeze stirred the lavender, carrying the scent between them, a cruel reminder of beauty in the middle of humiliation. Elaine stood frozen, her face pale with rage. Maya's hands trembled against her apron, and Charles remained kneeling, his expensive trousers darkened by the damp soil, the morning sunlight spilling over him like judgment. It was the first time anyone had ever seen the master of the house on his knees. That night, long after the estate had gone quiet, Maya sat on the edge of her narrow cot in the servants' quarters. The room smelled faintly of bleach and loneliness. The single bulb flickered overhead. She hadn't eaten the soup the cook had left at her door. She didn't trust it, didn't trust any kindness that came after humiliation. But as she stared out the small window toward the garden, she saw the patch of grass where it had all happened. She could still taste the dirt, bitter and real, and she whispered to herself, half in disbelief, half in prayer, no one saw me for so long, and now the one who did can never unsee. Outside, the wind swept through the trees, bending them gently toward the house as if bowing to a new kind of storm, one that began not with thunder, but with shame, and a man finally learning to look. The next morning dawned grey and quiet over the Fairview estate. The sun was slow to rise, as if even it hesitated to touch the house after what had happened the day before. A low fog hung over the west garden, blurring the neat lines of the hedges. Inside, the mansion carried its usual rhythm, clattering dishes from the kitchen, the muffled hum of a vacuum cleaner. But beneath it all, there was an unease that no one could name. Maya woke before dawn, as she always did. Her body had learned the habit long before luxury ever entered her life. She sat on the edge of her cot, rubbing her palms together for warmth. The small electric heater in the corner sputtered and hummed, pushing out only enough air to keep frost off the windows. Her stomach ached from emptiness, but she ignored it. Hunger had become a language she no longer needed to translate. She pulled on her faded grey uniform, tied the apron around her waist, and paused in front of the cracked mirror above the dresser. Her reflection stared back, a tired face, eyes rimmed with red, skin pale from stress. Yet there was something else there, something she couldn't quite name. Not hope, not yet, but something that looked like defiance, trying to remember how to breathe. Downstairs, the housekeeper, Mrs. Keating, was already in the kitchen, moving quietly between counters. When Maya entered, the older woman glanced up and froze. For years, Maya had been banned from that room. The kitchen was the center of the house, the place where rules were strongest, and the invisible boundaries that divided staff from family had always been most visible there. Maya, Mrs. Keating whispered, her voice trembling. You can't be in here. But before she could finish, another voice interrupted. She can, came Charles's calm tone from the doorway. Both women turned. Charles Fairview stood in the entrance, still wearing his white shirt from breakfast, sleeves rolled to his elbows. There was no trace of the businessman's polished detachment. His eyes were tired but clear, the kind of clarity that comes only after a man has been broken open. "Maya," he said gently, "have you eaten?" Her instinct was to lie, to say yes, to keep herself invisible, safe. But something in his voice, steady, unthreatening, made her answer differently. "No, sir." He nodded once, then turned to Mrs. Keating. "Make her something warm. Eggs, bread, whatever's ready." Mrs. Keating hesitated, torn between loyalty to the old hierarchy and the new order that had begun the moment he knelt in the garden. But the authority in his voice left no room for refusal. She moved to the stove. Maya stood frozen near the doorway, afraid to sit, afraid to breathe. "Please, sir," she whispered, "I don't want to cause trouble." "You didn't," he replied. "I did, by pretending not to see." She looked at him then, really looked, for the first time since she'd started working at the estate. His expression wasn't one of pity, it was one of guilt. And strangely, that made her feel safer than kindness ever had. When Mrs. Keating placed a plate of food on the counter, Maya stared at it as if it was something sacred. A slice of toast, 2 scrambled eggs, a bit of fruit, ordinary things. But to her, it might as well have been a feast. She sat at the small corner table, unsure if she was even allowed to eat there. When she picked up her fork, her hand shook. The first bite was mechanical, just an act of survival. The second one was slower. The third brought tears to her eyes. Charles watched quietly. He didn't speak, didn't move. He simply stood there as if keeping witness to the quiet undoing of years of cruelty. At that moment, Elaine Fairview entered. Her heels clicked against the marble floor, each step sharp as glass. The robe of the previous morning had been replaced with a tailored beige suit. Her hair was perfect, her posture commanding. When she saw Maya at the table, she stopped. "What is this?" she asked, her voice low, dangerous. Charles turned. "Breakfast," he said simply. "For her." Elaine's tone cut like ice. "In my kitchen?" He didn't flinch. "Yes, in your kitchen." Elaine's lips curled in disbelief. "You're joking." "No," he said quietly. "I'm correcting a mistake." Her face hardened. "You think this is noble? Feeding the help like they're guests? This is how order collapses." "Order?" Charles's voice rose slightly. "Is that what you call it when a woman eats grass in our garden?" Elaine's eyes darted toward Maya, then back to him. "She's manipulating you." "They always do." Maya stood quickly. "Please, Mrs. Fairview, I don't want—" "Be quiet," Elaine snapped. "You speak when spoken to." The words hung in the air like a slap. Charles's jaw tightened. "No, she speaks when she needs to. And if you can't live with that, Elaine, maybe it's you who doesn't belong here." Elaine's eyes flashed with something between disbelief and fury. She turned sharply on her heel and left the room without another word. Silence followed. Mrs. Keating stood frozen near the stove. Maya still clutched her fork. Charles exhaled slowly, the tension easing only when he heard Elaine's footsteps fade down the hallway. "Finish your breakfast," he said softly. After he left, Maya sat for a long time without eating another bite. The eggs had gone cold, but her heart was warm in a way she hadn't felt in years. That night, she sat by her small window again, the soup from the night before untouched beside her. Outside, the wind pressed softly against the glass. She thought of Elaine's voice, that cutting, practiced tone of power. She thought of Charles kneeling in the dirt. She thought of the moment she'd looked up and realized he wasn't just apologizing. He was breaking a rule older than the house itself, and somewhere deep inside, beneath years of silence, a thought bloomed like a seed planted in hard soil. Maybe change didn't start with anger. Maybe it started with someone finally refusing to look away. For the first time in her life, Maya whispered into the darkness, not to herself, but to the world that had ignored her, "I'm not invisible anymore." The following day arrived with a strange, unsettled energy. The sky over Connecticut was streaked with soft grey clouds that moved slow and heavy, as though the weather itself was waiting for something to happen. Inside the Fairview estate, that same feeling hung in the air, the sense that the house was holding its breath. By mid-morning, Charles had gathered the entire household staff in the East Lounge, a space normally reserved for cocktail parties and charity brunches. The air was heavy with silence and the faint scent of lemon polish. Housekeepers, gardeners, cooks and drivers stood in a loose semicircle, unsure why they had been called. Maya stood near the back, her hands clasped in front of her apron. Her heart was pounding. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. Charles entered quietly, no entourage, no pretense. He wasn't dressed like the billionaire CEO people saw on magazine covers. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, and his expression calm but fierce with purpose. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice firm but not cold. "I owe each of you an apology." Murmurs rippled through the group. No one knew what to say. A rich man apologizing to his staff was not something that happened in houses like this. "For years," he continued, "I lived in this home believing it was fair, believing that silence meant peace. But it wasn't peace. It was fear, and I let it happen." He turned his gaze toward Maya for the briefest second. Her eyes met his, steady but unsure. "I learned something yesterday," Charles said, pacing slowly. "I learned that under my roof someone went hungry, not because of poverty, but because of cruelty disguised as order." Mrs. Keating lowered her head. One of the gardeners, Raphael, shifted uneasily. The drivers exchanged glances. Charles's tone deepened. "That ends today." He moved closer to the center of the room. "From this day forward, no one in this house will be denied food or rest. The kitchen is open to all staff during designated hours. No more restrictions. No more locked doors." The room went utterly silent. The staff stared at him, their disbelief almost visible. "If you work here," he said slowly, "you eat here. You rest here. And you are treated like a human being, not an accessory to someone else's comfort." A long pause followed. No one moved. Then Mrs. Keating's hand went to her mouth, her eyes wet. "I also need you to know," Charles continued, "that if you've ever been insulted, punished or silenced, my door is open to you. All of you. I can't fix what I ignore." It was Raphael, the oldest gardener, who finally broke the quiet. His voice was hesitant but steady. "Sir, are you sure this is allowed?" "Mrs. Fairview," Charles didn't let him finish. "Mrs. Fairview no longer sets policy in this house." A sharp gasp came from somewhere in the back of the room. Elaine's absence was not an accident. She had chosen to stay in her suite, furious, avoiding what she called the spectacle of misplaced compassion. But even behind closed doors, she could not stop what was already changing. For a moment, no one knew what to do. Then quietly, as if afraid to believe it, a young maid named Selina stepped forward. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. "Truly." Charles gave a small nod, but his gaze drifted again toward Maya. Later that afternoon, he drove into the nearby town where his family's law firm had its office. The building was small but old, lined with mahogany furniture and walls covered in certificates that bore the Fairview name. His father had trusted the firm for years, but Charles wasn't here to uphold tradition. He was here to undo it. He met privately with his attorney, Mr. Allen, and requested the immediate transfer of all household authority, management, finances, and staffing decisions back into his own name. For years, Elaine had legally controlled those aspects through a marital trust. It had been her realm, her empire within his fortune. But not anymore. When Charles returned home that evening, Elaine was waiting. She sat in the drawing room, poised like a queen out of place in her own castle. A crystal tumbler of scotch rested in her manicured hand. "You've humiliated me," she said before he could speak. "Do you have any idea what you've done? The staff are gossiping, the neighbors will find out, and for what? A performance." Charles remained standing. It wasn't a performance. It was truth. Elaine's eyes narrowed. "Truth, you think this maid deserves your sympathy?" "She's using you, Charles." "They all are," he exhaled slowly. "No, Elaine, she's reminding me that wealth means nothing if it buys silence." "You're being naive," she snapped. "You give people like her power and they'll destroy you. That's what happens when you blur the lines between servant and master." Charles's voice turned to steel. "Maybe the problem is that there are still lines to blur." Elaine rose from her seat, her silk skirt whispering against the carpet. "You'll regret this," she said. "I built this household, Charles. The order, the perfection, the reputation. You're dismantling everything I worked for." He looked at her quietly for a long moment, then said, "No, Elaine, I'm rebuilding what you destroyed. Dignity." She laughed once, bitter and sharp. "You're turning into a sentimental fool." "Maybe," he said, moving toward the door. "But I'd rather be a fool with a conscience than a king with none." That night, the house was quieter than it had been in years. The tension that usually hummed under every surface had shifted into something new, uncertain, fragile, but lighter. In the servants' quarters, Maya lay awake again, staring at the ceiling. She had heard the whispers about the meeting, about what Charles had said, but she didn't know if she believed any of it. Kindness, in her experience, came with conditions. Then, just before midnight, there was another knock on her door. She hesitated before opening it. Charles stood there again, this time holding a stack of envelopes. "These are back payments," he said quietly. "Elaine withheld wages from several of you, including you. I made sure it's corrected." Maya stared at the envelope he handed her. "It felt heavy, heavier than money should. I can't accept." "You already earned it," he said. She looked up at him, the dim hallway light catching the exhaustion on both their faces. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. "Because of guilt." Charles shook his head slowly. "Because of truth." He turned to leave, but paused. "Tomorrow things will start changing around here. Don't hide any more." When he was gone, Maya sat back on the cot and opened the envelope. Inside was not just money, but a handwritten note. "This house no longer belongs to silence." Her eyes blurred with tears she hadn't planned to shed. For the first time since she'd come to the Fairview estate, she felt something she had long forgotten how to feel. Not safety, not even peace, but possibility. Outside her window, the wind swept softly through the trees, and the grass she once chewed to survive shimmered faintly under the pale moonlight. No longer a symbol of shame, but of endurance. In the stillness, Maya whispered to herself, "If the powerful can kneel, maybe the world can change." The next morning arrived with a sky so blue it almost seemed deliberate, as if nature itself had decided to draw a new curtain over the Fairview estate. But inside the mansion, beneath the crystal chandeliers and polished oak floors, a quiet storm had begun. Every hallway carried whispers. Every glance between the staff was cautious but alive with curiosity. For the first time in years, Maya walked through the corridors of the house without keeping her eyes fixed on the ground. The uniform still felt like a reminder of her place, but something had shifted. A different kind of air filled the space now. The doors to the kitchen were open. The smell of bread and coffee drifted freely through the halls, and laughter, small, tentative laughter, could be heard from the back corridor where the staff quarters began. When Maya entered the kitchen, Mrs. Keating greeted her with a smile. "Sit," she said gently. "Breakfast's ready." Maya hesitated, glancing around, expecting Elaine to appear any second with one of her sharp, slicing remarks. But Elaine was nowhere to be found. The silence that followed was not oppressive this time. It was a silence of absence, the kind that allows something new to grow in its place. Maya sat at the long table with the rest of the staff for the first time. A few of them avoided her eyes, unsure of what to say. Others, like young Selina, gave her a shy nod of acknowledgement. "You really think this will last?" One of the gardeners, Raphael, whispered. "I've seen promises come and go in this house." Maya stirred her oatmeal slowly. "Maybe it won't," she said softly. "But at least now we know it can start." Upstairs, Charles stood by his office window overlooking the garden. The morning light fell across his desk, highlighting stacks of papers and unopened letters, most of them from his corporate office in New York. His assistant had called twice already, asking about missed meetings, press inquiries, investor updates. He ignored them all. For once, business could wait. He thought of Maya's face, the disbelief in her eyes when he'd given her that envelope, the quiet dignity in her silence. He had seen ambition, greed, and fear in 1,000 faces during his career. But what he'd seen in hers was something rare, endurance. When his phone rang again, he finally picked up. "Mr. Fairview, the board wants reassurance," his secretary said carefully. "They're concerned about—" Publicity? He repeated, a bitter smile curving at the edge of his mouth. "I feed a starving woman and they call it publicity? Sir, there are rumors. The staff changes, your wife's absence from public events. People are asking questions." "Let them ask," he said, and hung up. Downstairs, the mansion was breathing differently. For the first time in years, it felt human. But change always comes with resistance, and Elaine Fairview had never been a woman who accepted defeat quietly. In her private suite, she stood before the mirror, brushing her golden hair in long mechanical strokes. Her reflection stared back like a stranger. The elegant woman who had once ruled this estate with an iron hand was now watching her authority slip through. Her manicured fingers. She set down the brush and reached for her phone. "Harold," she said when the line connected. "Yes, I need a full review of the household contracts, payroll, management, staff hierarchy, all of it. My husband seems to have lost his mind." Her voice softened into something colder. "And Harold, make it look official. I want this done quietly." That afternoon, Charles called Maya to his study. When she arrived, she paused at the door, uncertain whether to knock or enter. The room was filled with sunlight, its walls lined with leather-bound books and family portraits, each one a reminder of a long history of control and wealth. "Come in, Maya," Charles said, looking up from his desk. "Please sit." She stayed standing. "I prefer to stand, sir." He smiled faintly. "Then I'll stand too." He rose and walked to the window beside her. The garden spread before them, the same garden where everything had changed. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," he began. "About your son." Her fingers tightened around her apron. "Elijah," she said softly. "Yes," he nodded. "You said he's sick. What does he need?" She hesitated. "A surgery. Heart condition." The hospital in Atlanta said, "It's expensive." "Too expensive." Charles's gaze lowered. "I can help with that." She looked up sharply. "No, please don't. I'm not asking for pity." "It's not pity," he said. "It's responsibility. You've given this house more than anyone should have to. Let me do something real." Maya shook her head. "You don't understand. People like me, we don't get helped without paying a price." His eyes softened. "Then consider it a debt this house owes you. Not charity." Silence filled the room. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, the sound mingling with the faint ticking of the clock. Finally, Maya whispered, "You can't undo what she's done." "No," he said, "but I can stop her from doing more." That evening, Charles met again with his attorney and signed the final set of documents, transferring full operational authority of the estate back under his control. The ink dried slowly, each stroke a quiet act of rebellion against the years of cruelty that had been disguised as discipline. When he returned home, Elaine was waiting at the bottom of the grand staircase. Her posture was regal, her voice smooth as glass. "So it's true," she said. "You've taken everything." "I've taken back what was always mine," he replied. She tilted her head, her smile tight. "You've embarrassed me, Charles, publicly. Do you know what people are saying?" "That you've gone soft, that a servant has turned you sentimental." He didn't blink. "Maybe they're right." Her smile faded. "You'll ruin this family." "No," he said quietly. "I'll save what's left of it." Elaine's voice dropped, venomous now. "And what about her?" "That woman? You think she's your redemption? She'll destroy you the way all weak people do, by needing you." Charles took a slow breath, his voice calm but cold. "She doesn't need me, Elaine. She just deserves better than you ever gave." Elaine's hand twitched, her nails digging into her palm. "You're a fool." He turned to leave. "Then I'll be a fool on the right side of history." When he was gone, Elaine stood alone in the hall, her reflection flickering in the polished marble floor. For the first time in her life, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. That night, Maya returned to her small room and sat by the window again. The garden below shimmered in the moonlight, silver and soft. She could still see the faint patch of earth where she had knelt and eaten grass. Only now it looked different, not a wound but a reminder. She whispered to herself, "Some places heal slow, but they do heal." And outside the wind carried the faintest echo of laughter, not mocking, not cruel, but alive. The sound of a house beginning at last to remember what it meant to be human. The sun rose the next day with a fragile, golden calm over the Fairview estate, but beneath that beauty, tension was quietly building, the kind that hides in corners, behind polite smiles, under polished silver and pressed linen. The house was changing, yes, but the battle for its soul had only just begun. Maya had barely slept. Every hour of the night had been a swirl of new realities. Charles's promise to help Elijah, the steady way he had looked at her when he said she deserved better, and the memory of Elaine's cold, venomous gaze at the base of the staircase. Power had shifted, not completely, but enough for the cracks to show. She rose before dawn, as she always did. Her room, once a symbol of confinement, now felt different. The walls seemed less suffocating, the air less still. She took a deep breath and stepped into the hallway. Downstairs, the kitchen hummed with a new kind of energy. The smell of toast, butter, and freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Staff members spoke in low voices, laughing now and then, small, nervous bursts of relief that something had finally broken the old silence. Mrs. Keating looked up from the stove when Maya entered. "Good morning, house manager," she said with a teasing smile that made Maya blush. "Don't say that," Maya whispered quickly, glancing around. "It's true," Mrs. Keating replied. "He told everyone yesterday. You're the new manager, official." Maya froze. He said that?" The cook nodded. "You earned it." The words hit Maya harder than she expected. For a long moment she couldn't speak. She'd worked her whole life to survive, not to lead. And yet, here she was, being trusted with authority in the same house that had once forbidden her to step into its kitchen. She took a slow breath. "Then I guess we'd better make this house worth managing." Upstairs, Charles was in his study, staring at the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. His desk was covered in papers, legal documents, staffing schedules, renovation plans. But his attention was elsewhere. He thought of the night before, of the words he and Elaine had exchanged. He knew her anger wasn't done. Elaine Fairview didn't accept loss. She planned around it. And he could already feel the shadow of her retaliation looming over the house. A soft knock broke his thoughts. "Come in," he said. Maya stepped inside, hesitant but composed. She was wearing a crisp blouse instead of her usual maid's uniform, her hair neatly tied back. She looked strong, professional, and quietly determined. Charles smiled faintly. "It suits you," she frowned slightly. "What does?" "Being in charge." "I'm not in charge," she said quickly. "I'm just helping you manage the chaos you started." He laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd ever heard from him. "Then I'd say you're doing better than I ever did." She stepped closer, folding her hands. "I wanted to ask, does Elaine know about your promotion?" "Yes," he said, his tone careful. "She'll make noise, but she can't undo it." "Not legally." "Not legally," Maya repeated. "But she doesn't fight fair." Charles's smile faded. "No, she doesn't. But this time, she's not the only one with power." Maya studied him for a moment. "You really think we can change this house?" He looked around the study, at the portraits of generations of Fairviews who had built their fortune on the backs of people like her. Then he said quietly, "We already have." That afternoon, Maya began her new role. She gathered the staff in the East Lounge again, not for orders, but for conversation. "I don't want you to call me Mom," she said firmly. "Call me Maya. This house has enough walls without us building more with words." Some of them smiled, others looked confused. Raphael, the old gardener, raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," she said. "We're starting over together." For the first time, people laughed freely. Mrs. Keating even clapped her hands softly, but the fragile peace didn't last long. In the main hall, Elaine Fairview stood at the top of the grand staircase, watching from above. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes burned. When the meeting ended, she descended slowly, her heels echoing across the marble. Maya turned as she approached, instinctively straightening her shoulders. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Fairview," she said politely. Elaine's gaze swept over her. Not the way one looks at a person, but the way one examines an insect. "I see my husband's little social experiment is underway," she said. "How quaint. I'm just doing my job," Maya replied evenly. "No," Elaine said softly, "you're doing my job. And you're doing it in my house." Maya didn't move. "It's the Fairview house, ma'am. And I believe Mr. Fairview still shares the name." Elaine's lips curved in a cold smile. "You've learned to speak boldly. Be careful. The last maid who did that didn't last a week." "I'm not her," Maya said quietly. "And this isn't that house anymore." Elaine stepped closer, her perfume thick and sharp, her words like a hiss. "Don't mistake charity for equality. When Charles loses interest in his latest crusade, you'll be back where you started, cleaning floors and praying for scraps." Maya met her gaze without blinking. "If that happens, at least I'll know I stood for something real before I fell." For a moment, silence filled the hall. Elaine's jaw tightened. Then she turned and walked away, her heels striking the floor like punctuation marks of fury. When she was gone, Maya exhaled, her hands trembling. She didn't realize until that moment that the staff had been watching from the archway. No one spoke, but their eyes said everything. That night, Maya stood again by her small window, looking out at the garden. The air smelled faintly of rain. The grass shimmered softly under the moonlight, the same grass she had once chewed to survive. But tonight, she saw something new in it, a reflection of herself, resilient. Scarred but alive, downstairs, laughter floated from the kitchen. The sound of people finally breathing, and for the first time since she had come to this house. Maya Williams allowed herself a thought that once seemed too dangerous to hold. This place might one day feel like home. But deep inside, she also knew the real storm hadn't yet begun, and when it did, she would have to be ready. The storm finally came. Not with thunder or lightning, but in the quiet, deliberate cruelty that only power can craft. It began on a Tuesday morning, crisp and deceptively calm, when a black SUV rolled through the iron gates of the Fairview estate and, parked neatly by the marble steps, Maya was in the kitchen reviewing the new work schedule. When she saw it through the window, the glossy car, the tinted windows, the kind of vehicle that didn't belong to guests but to messengers of bad news. Her stomach tightened. A man in a dark suit stepped out, tall, polished, the kind of person who never smiled because he never needed to. He carried a small briefcase and moved with the rehearsed precision of someone who'd spent years delivering ultimatums. Charles met him at the door. "Mr. Fairview," the man said, extending a hand. "Damon Calloway, legal representative for the board of Fairview Holdings." Charles's jaw stiffened, but he shook his hand. "What brings you here?" Calloway's tone was professional, almost sympathetic. "The board has concerns, sir. The recent events surrounding your household have drawn unwanted attention. The media coverage, the arbitration hearings, the employee testimonies. Investors are uneasy. So they sent a lawyer," Charles said, his voice calm but edged. "They sent me to protect your interests," Calloway replied, "and to remind you that the company's reputation is inseparable from yours. They're asking for assurance that these reforms at your estate will not compromise leadership confidence in Fairview Holdings." Behind him, Maya appeared in the doorway. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the tone of the conversation froze her in place. Calloway noticed her just briefly before turning back to Charles. "It might be wise, Mr. Fairview, to issue a statement, distance yourself from the controversy, clarify your position." Charles's expression didn't change. "You mean distance myself from her," he said quietly. "I didn't say that. You didn't have to." He took the envelope Calloway offered, opened it and scanned the papers, formal warnings, veiled threats, clauses written in the language of money and fear. He folded them carefully and looked up. "Tell the board," he said evenly, "that my leadership begins at home. And if they're so worried about ethics, I'll gladly introduce them to the people who kept their empire running while they looked away. Calloway adjusted his tie. That's not the kind of answer they want. It's the only kind they'll get, Charles replied. When the man left, the SUV disappearing down the long driveway, Maya stepped forward. They're coming for you, she said softly. Let them, he answered. I've already lost worse things, my integrity once. I'm not losing it again. That night, Charles called another meeting in the East Lounge. The staff gathered nervously, sensing something important. He stood beside Maya this time, not in front of her. I need to tell you the truth, he said. There might be consequences to what we're doing. People in power don't like change. They'll call it rebellion, chaos, even betrayal. But it isn't. It's humanity. And if that costs me everything, so be it. No one moved for a long moment. Then Selina, the young maid, raised her hand timidly. If it costs you, it costs us too. Are you sure we're ready for that? Charles looked at Maya, then back at the staff. That's not my decision to make, he said. It's ours. And for the first time, Maya spoke up before anyone else could. We've lived afraid long enough. If silence protected us, none of this would have happened. If they call this rebellion, then maybe rebellion is what justice sounds like. A ripple of quiet agreement spread through the room. People nodded. Some cried. The house that had once run on fear was now beginning to move on courage, but the fight wasn't done. The next morning, Elaine Fairview returned. She arrived unannounced. Dressed in black, her expression sharp enough to cut glass. The entire staff froze when she stepped through the foyer. Even the air seemed to stop moving. Maya was the first to face her. Mrs. Fairview, she said evenly. We weren't expecting you. Elaine's lips curved in a hard smile. I can see that. I leave for a few weeks and suddenly the help thinks they're in charge. This isn't about charge, Maya said. It's about respect. Elaine's eyes flashed. Respect? I gave this house structure. I made it something worth serving. You've turned it into a circus. Charles entered from the study. She turned it into a home, he said quietly. Elaine turned sharply toward him.
A home?
Her voice cracked with rage. You've ruined everything our name stood for. This, she pointed at Maya, this woman will cost you everything. Charles looked at her steadily. If everything I had depended on cruelty, then it was never worth keeping. For a moment, the two stood facing each other, years of resentment, betrayal, and buried contempt between them, like an invisible wall. Then Elaine's voice dropped, low and trembling. You'll regret this, Charles. You'll regret choosing her over me. He didn't raise his voice. I didn't choose her over you. I chose what was right over what was easy. Elaine said nothing more. She turned, her heels striking the floor like gunshots, and vanished up the staircase to her old suite. But her return set something off. The next few days were chaos. Lawyers called. Journalists parked near the estate gates. Rumors swirled online. Stories about the billionaire who knelt before his maid, about the disgraced socialite wife, about the revolution inside a mansion. Then, one afternoon, a reporter's drone hovered over the garden, capturing footage of the now famous West Lawn, the place where everything had begun. The clip went viral within hours. The story caught fire. Maya's name spread across the internet. Interviews, articles, talk shows. I ate grass because I thought no one cared. That one quote from her testimony became a headline, a symbol. When she found out, she felt sick. Fame was never what she wanted. She stayed inside for days, trying to ignore the world. But the world wouldn't ignore her. Messages flooded in from across the country. Other domestic workers, mothers, janitors, nannies, people who had lived invisible for years and now saw themselves in her story. Charles came to her office one evening, a manila folder in hand. 200 letters, he said softly. And that's just from this morning. Maya opened one at random. A woman in Alabama wrote, I've been cleaning houses for 27 years. No one's ever said we deserve better. Thank you for saying it for us. Maya's eyes filled. They think I'm a hero, she whispered. But I'm just someone who got caught eating grass. Charles smiled gently. Sometimes that's how revolutions start, with someone refusing to stay hungry. A week later, Charles made a decision that would change everything again. He called a press conference. Not at his corporate office in Manhattan, but on the lawn of the Fairview estate. The same lawn that had once seen humiliation, now prepared to witness redemption. Television cameras lined the hedges. Reporters murmured in the chill air. Charles stepped to the microphone, Maya standing quietly beside him. "I was born into privilege," he began. "But privilege without conscience is corruption. This house, my house, allowed cruelty to live under its roof. I can't change the past, but I can decide what comes next." He gestured to Maya. "This is Maya Williams. She was a maid in this home. She was silenced, starved, and shamed until she refused to be silent anymore. Her courage has changed not just this estate, but me." Maya took a slow breath and stepped forward. The cameras flashed. "My name is Maya Williams," she said, her voice steady. "I was told to stay quiet, to keep my head down, to be invisible. But silence doesn't protect you. It just makes you disappear." She paused. "The entire crowd was still. I ate grass because I thought no one would care. But someone did. And now I speak not for pity, but for every worker who's ever been told their pain was just the price of survival. You are seen. You are enough." The world listened. That night, the video played on every major network. Across America, her words echoed through living rooms, phones, and hearts. In a quiet apartment in Atlanta, a boy named Elijah, frail but smiling, watched his mother on television and whispered, "That's my mom." Weeks later, the Fairview Foundation for Workers' Dignity opened its first office in Boston, with Maya as its executive director. Her first project was simple: free legal aid and emergency support for domestic workers. Charles stepped back from the spotlight, focusing on restructuring his company's labor policies nationwide. Elaine, meanwhile, retreated to Manhattan, her influence fading with every headline she refused to read. Spring came, and the estate bloomed again. The West Garden, once a place of humiliation, was now a memorial garden, open to visitors, planted with lavender, rosemary, and wild grass. A small plaque stood at its center: "Let no one ever be invisible again." Every morning, Maya walked there with Elijah. He was stronger now, his surgery successful, his laughter louder. He would run through the grass barefoot, and every time he did, she felt her throat tighten with gratitude and disbelief. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the mansion in amber light, Charles joined her in the garden. They stood quietly for a while, watching Elijah chase fireflies across the lawn. "He's healing fast," Charles said softly. "So am I," Maya replied. He smiled. "You changed everything, Maya." She shook her head gently. "No, Mr. Fairview, we changed it together." They stood there as the fireflies glowed brighter and the night began to hum. Two people who had once been bound by silence now standing in the same light. Proof that dignity, once awakened, can never be buried again, and somewhere beneath